Now we'll get to the toughie, man overboard. Well, unfortunately, a man overboard in blue water is a very, very dangerous situation. And it is, we all took our classes, I hope we all took our classes, and they say, well, when you have a man overboard, you got one person that points and you got one person that drives, and you can argue about if you're doing a figure-8 turn or a big loop or what have you and this have you, but it isn't likely to be that way. We're sailing short-handed. It's going to be a rough, dark, stormy night. It's going to be the man overboard. When you go overboard, you're going to be the only one on deck. You're probably going to be injured or unconscious when you go overboard, because we don't just walk down the deck and decide to jump overboard. We walk over the deck and something happens, we get conked on the head and go overboard. So, it is an unfortunate case that if you go overboard in blue water, your odds are not very good. But you can prevent going overboard, partly by simply understanding that your odds are not very good if you go, and you're going to have to really work at staying on board. And you're going to have jack lines and tethers. You're going to have a life jacket that you're going to wear, and you're going to hook on, and you have a procedure. And the procedure is going to say something like, if you're the only person on deck, even if it's flat calm and you're motoring, you're going to clip on if you ever leave the cockpit. And if it's rough, you're going to click on when you're in the cockpit. And by having a procedure like this, then when it gets rough, you've already clicked on and walked around the boat a few hundred times. You got it down. You know how to do this. It isn't your first time trying it out. So do this in the calm while you can. And then we're going to talk about, well, if you do go overboard, what are the things that are going to improve your odds? Well, the good news is if you're wearing a life jacket and you go overboard in the tropics, you can survive as long as 2 days. You die of dehydration. Almost anywhere else in the world, you die of exposure. You freeze to death before anything else happens. But so you're good for 2 days. And I'm going to talk about 2 products. And Dick Markey was talking about a laser product, but I'm going to talk about 2 things. These are the only 2 that I'm going to mention in this pitch, only because they are things you may or may not have thought of.
We don't have any financial interest.
We got no interest in these products, but
we just think they really work.
The first is, if you go overboard, here we have an emergency locator. And this is a personal emergency locator. It goes on your life jacket, and it automatically deploys if the life jacket inflates. This one happens to have a strobe on it. And these emergency locators come in 2 flavors. There are the AIS kind and the EPIRB kind, and they've got strengths and weaknesses. I prefer the AIS kind. The AIS kind, do any of you have these? Well, it's got a little test button. You put the test button on, and the position of this locator shows up on your chart plotter. So anybody else can find you again. This one happens to have a strobe on it, because if you go overboard at night, if you don't have a strobe or a serious light that goes on automatically, it's unlikely that anybody's going to find you, even if they're quite close.
Also, our life vests have a separate strobe.
That's true. Now, these guys are a little expensive, and Kathy and I share one. And so when we come on watch, the person who's in charge of the watch, you give them the locator. And we call that passing the baton. And the problem of, well, not the problem, but the EPIRB, which is the other flavor, there's a personal EPIRB. It sends a signal to a satellite. The satellite relays that to a receiving station that might be in the US, might be in Russia, might be in England. And then the problem arises of how to communicate between that receiving station and your boat to find the person that's gone overboard, because you cannot receive the EPIRB signals directly on your boat. So it's a bit of an inconvenience. The good news of the EPIRB is that the range is outstanding. This uses a VHF signal. Range might be 2 miles tops. And the problem is, you want to make sure that it goes off within the 2-mile range. And Kathy and I use a timer. And many people have a little timer in the cockpit, and it dings every 15 minutes. And that tells you to get up and look around and see what's going on. This one has a reset button. If you have 1 minute to press the reset button, and if you do not press the reset button, the alarm goes off and wakes up your crew. So it is likely.
There's not an alarm, it's sirens.
Yeah.
Sirens go off.
Yeah, it is loud. So it is likely that if you go overboard, the siren will go off, but while you're still within range of the AIS. So these are two things that will hopefully reduce your risk of going overboard. Now, going on to putting this back on the chart, man overboard is a less likely event than having a fire. And unfortunately, though, if it is has very dire results. Now, as I say, there's going to be a guy talking about safety equipment and this and that, and a lot of these are personal decisions. And so you've got a lot of opportunity to decide what you want to do. And you need to decide what's important to you, because if you buy every piece of equipment that is suggested, your boat's going to ride a lot lower in the water, and it's going to be slower, and you have other risks. And I suggest that you review a safety list and don't necessarily buy everything on the list, but say, what is that piece of equipment designed to take care of? And if it's designed to solve this problem or protect you from this, is that a risk I'm willing to accept, or do I want to do something else that addresses the same risk, or do I want to just give up and stay home because I think the risk is too great? In the handout, there is a website URL to a safety checklist that I adapted from the ISAF standards. All of these standards come out of racing organizations, and to some extent the racing organizations have a different set of problems than cruisers because they're out in nastier weather. We'll talk about that in a moment. And so I've made a few adaptations that I've noted in that safety checklist that I think make it a little more appropriate to cruising. Not all risks are greater offshore. Some things get safer. Quoting the boat statistics, most boats that sink at the dock. And they sink at the dock because they're unattended. There's nobody there to say, yeah, there's a little water sloshing around, we better go figure out what the problem is and fix it. I talked about lightning. Turns out that drowning offshore is actually pretty unlikely. And this brings up an important point. There are actually a lot of people drown on their boats while they're at anchor, or get killed in some other way going back and forth in their dinghies. The process of getting onto a dinghy is a very dangerous one. That is probably more dangerous than sailing to the anchorage. Running aground is pretty unlikely on a blue water passage. Might happen, but pretty unlikely. Risks that go up when you go offshore, you're going to be further from help, which means that little things like torn tendons, you just have to live with that for 3 days or 4 days or however long it is until you get to a doctor to be able to get it splinted. Bad weather is likely to be unavoidable. Mike Danielson does great weather reports. They're good for today. They're okay for the next 3 or 4 days. After that, they're kind of speculative. This is fine until you start to do a 3-week passage, and when you get offshore, you're just going to have to take whatever you get. Well, whatever you get, it might be high winds, and you get used to it. Kathy and I started off being concerned about various conditions, but after we got going, winds at 30 with squalls gusting to 50 was no big deal. You just have to reef back when the squall is coming, and you just keep sailing. Wind, and Kathy and I can tell you this, if we have enough time, we can tell a story about this. Wind is not a problem to a sailboat. If you are prepared and you reef back, you can be in winds of 100 miles an hour. It's not a problem. Sea state can be a problem. Sea state can be a problem. But sea height, of course, doesn't matter. It's only steepness that's a problem. You can be out in a beautiful blue day and you're going up and down on a 25-foot swell. This is nothing. But if you're on a 25-foot breaking sea, this can be a serious hazard. So you want to be a little careful to think when you listen to your weather reports. I don't really care what the sea height is. I want to know how steep it is. And to some extent, that means that the wave period is a more important number than the wave height. Man overboard, risks are high. I say the boat can take conditions that you cannot. Especially to people who are non-sailors, I say things become uncomfortable and unpleasant and extremely unpleasant long before they become truly dangerous. And this, I thought, was an opportunity to show this little video clip that I picked up. And I saw this and I looked at it a couple of times, and I wanted to, it raised a few questions. These are sea conditions you are very unlikely to encounter in the South Pacific. The trade winds blow continuously, which means you don't get this short sea, you don't get a steep sea. If you get a big sea, it's likely to be a big swell, and it's really not a problem. So question number one is, where were these people sailing, and why were they sailing there in these conditions? Question number two is, you look at this boat, and I will certainly say whatever ride these people are getting, it's exceedingly unpleasant. But is it dangerous? I can't tell. Boat looks like it's handling it pretty well. It's not getting knocked down. It's not taking water over the side. It looks pretty good. And of course, the third question is, who's taking this video?